Welcome to Fringe Pop 321, the show that believes the world is stranger than we think, but thinking should not be strange. We are back once again with Dr. Judd Burton, talking witches and witchcraft. And I think for the sake of our viewers who may have watched the prior segments, you know, we talked a little bit about the witch profile, okay? And there's this is something that you can learn about and discern, certainly with written texts, but also before. And when we're talking about before writing, you use the term primal witch, antediluvian, prehistoric, again, something before writing. And the way that, you know, scholars have learned about those practices and then really how they align once you do get writing is through, you know, the disciplines of anthropology, you know, where you can look at comparative cultures even today who are without writing, and sort of how they look at their world, the magical worldview that they have. And so we've been talking about, okay, like how did these cultures look at this person that we would call a witch? And it's someone, you know, we said certainly that is in concert with or in communion with or is doing something on a practitioner level with, you know, supernatural intelligences, believing that they can barter with those intelligences for power or to, you know, come up with solutions for problems. You know, on either side, you know, whether the community would perceive it as good or evil, this is what they're doing. They have a certain, you know, skill set, you know, to be able to apply, you know, that knowledge. And we talked about how the community might perceive them. And so, you know, when we get into these subjects, and here we are in the 21st century, and there's still sort of I would say a pretty high interest in witchcraft, both historically, and then people who would want to sort of do these things today. But let's just start with the historical side of it, because you know, I think the average listener is going to be listening to this and thinking about, well, what about like witch trials? You know, I mean, obviously the ones in Salem are the most, you know, well-known in terms of American history, but you have this kind of thing where people even today are put on trial for being this thing, or at least being perceived this way. How would you approach that whole subject? Like, were the girls and the people involved in the Salem witch trials, were they really, you know, sort of in touch with, you know, demonic or, you know, antediluvian, you know, Apkallu watcher intelligences? Is this really what they were, or are they being misidentified and accused wrongly? Or, you know, what's going on here when we have these discussions, especially when people are punished in some pretty severe ways, even today? I mean, how does this align?
Certainly, there are still countries today that punish witchcraft. I believe Saudi Arabia is one.
Yeah, that wouldn't surprise me at all.
Yeah. I think as recently as 2014, they executed somebody for witchcraft. Wow. But in the case of a historical discussion, in the early modern era is what you're talking about. Salem, the trials and the whole milieu of events that took place there, part of a larger period that historians refer to as the witch craze era in the 16th and 17th century. And believe it or not, you know, although much of that is taking place in the Protestant world, the catalyst for a lot of it is a document that was produced as a result of a papal bull in the 15th century and led to the creation of a work which became a kind of manual for ferreting out, trying.
A witch detection manual?
Exactly. It was called the Malleus Maleficarum, which means the witch's hammer in Latin. And this was not only utilized in the Catholic world, but the tenets of it, you know, became, you saw it rewritten and reworked for the Protestant world too. And in a lot of these Protestant countries.
How informed was that on the basis of some of the things we've talked about up to this point? Or was it more, I mean, I hate to use the word like contrived, but I guess I will. I mean, if we're flipping through the manual on how to identify a witch, were they talking about the same things that you've been talking about, or is it just something totally different?
Well, again, you have to take in all of these cultural variables. You know, that form the backdrop of writing a document like the Malleus Maleficarum. You know, at the time, women were thought to be more susceptible to witchcraft because they were supposed to be, you know, more sensuous, and that made them somehow more susceptible to the devil's wiles. So it was a, you know, in many ways, it was a misogynistic sort of a document. You know, it had a clear slant against women. Not that there weren't men, of course, who were, you know, accused of witchcraft and tried out, but because of a number of things that we've sort of alluded to in previous conversations about the fact that women at the time didn't have access to the legal system, they tried other things to even the playing field that could be construed as magical, or even if they weren't magical, the accusation of witchcraft carried a great deal of weight.
Right.
Even beyond the burden of proof.
Yeah, I mean, if you're doing something beyond the official channels, it would be very easy to just say witchcraft.
Heretic, witchcraft, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, well, that's unfortunate. So would you put a lot of these sort of cases in that bucket that you have, you know, you don't have a bunch of little girls at Salem, you know, in communion with, you know, watcher spirits or something like that, but maybe they're doing something that, you know, would easily lend itself to this accusation?
I would say the more likely case in the Salem instance would be that their imaginations were excited by tales told to them by a slave from the Caribbean, Tituba in this case. But that has several different layers. You know, there were people who were accused of witchcraft that, you know, didn't go to church regularly, if at all.
Right, and
that's
what we would expect a witch, you know,
exactly.
To do.
You know, they might live on the edge of town, you know, because that was the only property that they could get. You know, typically at that time, you know, well into the 1800s. I mean, the frontier land is, you know, the periphery is going to be the cheapest sort of real estate that you can get. So that puts you literally on the periphery of a given society. You know, if you owed money to a wealthy individual in town, you know, all of these things are interplaying in the case of Salem. The interesting thing about Salem, as a footnote to that, is that it completely changed our idea about the burden of proof in American history, in American culture, because you were innocent until proven guilty. After that, up until that point, you had to prove your innocence. And you know, a generation later, you know, even some of the people who were on the administrative end of that said, "Look, we messed up. We were wrong." And that's a pattern that's repeated quite a bit in, you know, early modern witchcraft, or supposed cases of early modern witchcraft.
Yeah, I don't think this has anything to do with the specific Salem incident, but you know, we talked last time in terms of the witch profile about just using plants and herbs, you know, to make, you know, again, even the word potion just has this negative connotation to it. But they're doing things like this, maybe as a healing agent or something like that. But if it's something that let's just say the townspeople aren't familiar with, it could be something totally neutral. But if somebody finds out that you're doing that thing, and the townspeople don't know, well, it must be witchcraft. You know, it's just so easy to take the unfamiliar and just, you know, sort of give it this convenient label, especially if you give them a reason to be suspicious of you in some other regard, like, you know, you owe lots of money, or you know, or if you're a woman and all of a sudden you don't owe money, then they're going to think you're, you know, being a prostitute or something. I mean, there's all these dots that people connect, you know, would have connected culturally in their minds that may not correspond to reality at all, but that really didn't matter. You know? It's like the shoe that we're going to make the shoe fit, and then you're going to wear it.
Right, and there's a pretty good, you know, document trail. You know, looking at things on this side of history, you know, there have been historians like Paul Boyer and a whole laundry list of historians who have gone back and traced the documents back to the period. it's pretty clear that what you're looking at here is an uneven legal playing field, and a wide berth of possibilities for accusations to get back at people. That's not to say, you just think law of averages statistically, that, okay, out of 100, maybe 1 or 2 might fit this profile of a primal witch. You might never find out, because they again, it's a sort of, black market spiritual economy. They may be operating on the periphery so far that.
Right. I mean, just because historically they're hopelessly wrong in this list of cases,
right,
doesn't mean that no one was doing this.
Right.
Yeah.
And we know that there were people that practiced varying degrees of this, of what's come to be known as hearth religions. They might keep trinkets on their fireplace, and might be herbalists passed down. They may not even know why they have them. They've just been in the family for that long, and they may throw salt over their shoulder and not know why they do. Something as innocuous as that, but it might have, at one time it had some sort of religious
it had a history.
Yeah, it had a history behind it. We find what amounts to a paucity of archaeological evidence for this sort of thing, but it does turn up. In the historical record, you have there's a great book called Binding Passions by a microhistorian called Guido Ruggiero. Now, a microhistorian is not a really short historian. It's somebody who focuses in on a very narrow time and space. There have been some other really good ones like Carlo Ginzburg. He's also done some really interesting work on an Italian agrarian cult from this time period that Netflix actually made into a series recently, I think.
Is that the bark skin?
It's
thing?
about it's about they're called the Benedante.
Okay.
But Ruggiero has these interesting little culture sketches that he does. He talks about, for instance, one lady, again, had no access to the legal system, but in order to level the playing field, she used this sort of syncretistic ritual. She made a waxen dolly,
sure,
as a kind of imitative magic, like not unlike a voodoo doll, and placed it next to the altar in the church, thinking that it would draw, it would somehow draw power from the altar. So you have this Christian element and these probably older pagan, nature spirit sort of elements being combined. That sort of stuff, does show up sometime in the document trail and in archaeology sometimes too.
How does this relate to, again, moving to something more contemporary? Because again, in our culture, I think just broadly, people are familiar with witchcraft because of things like Salem. Then you get Hollywood movies, and that those are basically most of the time just let's just throw everything into the blender and see what comes out in the script. There's no real point to the script. But you get your Hollywood movies, and then you get the modern sort of, I think it's fair to say, revival of Wicca. I mean, how does Wicca, for instance, overlap or not with some of the things we've been talking about?
Wicca, in a kind of a way, is a reconstruction. It's got elements of a revitalization movement, except that because there's not a document trail, because there's not a continuous tradition.
Yeah, like a linear witness. It just doesn't. It's not there.
It's not there. It has to be reconstructed. That's not to say that they necessarily get everything wrong with the tradition. It's been my experience with the work that I've done amongst neo-pagans that there are elements, that do trace back to whatever, and there are a myriad of traditions. They're Celtic and Norse and, Greco-Roman.
Do you think a lot of it is just sort of earth worship, as opposed to this more sinister,
in a
like
in a
spirit
general sense,
watcher thing?
they would profess that they espouse, the benevolent side of nature.
Mm-hmm. So not trying to control it, like I'm not going to send a lightning bolt against my neighbor. It's
right.
not, that's not what they're thinking.
Right.
But what doing what? Just becoming one with it. Like is it really energized by monism here, or?
In a way, and there are any number of ways that they try to do that. They identify elements of nature with ancient Celtic deities or Norse deities or what have you, and become devotees of those of one sort or another. So again,
so there can still be that really ancient deity kind of thing going on.
Yes, but again, it's a reconstruction. It's it's there's not
there's no one path to follow.
There aren't centuries of documents and witches' journals, and grimoires or whatever that chart this continuity.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, let's just say like we can do this, but the average Wiccan, okay, may or may not be a person who believes that there are other spirits, like in a true entity-like existence or language. But at the very least, they're for lack of a better way of putting it, they're engaged in earth worship or getting back in tune with the earth, or however we want to say that. Do you think that's fair? That some of them would be in agreement that there really are other spirit beings out there that are part of nature, and we're communing with them, as opposed to just sort of wiping that part off the table? Do you think you could get Wiccans of both varieties there?
Yes, I do. Yeah,
Okay.
and there's some who appreciate the more, almost Jungian or archetypal elements of mythology and appreciate it that way. And then there are those who literally believe that they're worshiping some sentient aspect of nature or an ancient god.
Yeah, I actually ran into something like this in a totally different context. This person was not a Wiccan, but it's got to be maybe, I don't know, is it 10, maybe 10 years ago, maybe that long. But I went to an American Academy of Religion regional meeting, and there was a guy named Jordan Paper there he's a practicing polytheist. And I had just read his little book called The Gods Are Many. It was a theology of polytheism. It's just a little paperback book. But I heard that he was going to be at the regionals, and so I went to his session, and he was very open about this. I mean, he just I'm a practicing polytheist. You've all got my book. You all read this book, and for him, he really did think that when nature did something, like if you're walking down the street and the wind blows and it makes you turn your head and you see this thing and then that leads you to a decision. Well, that was the gods. You know what I mean? That this sort of this concatenation of events that involves natural forces. To him that was being led by a specific spirit or entity, and he would talk about his whole system of worship. Solicitation was very important. This none of this was accidental. You had to engage it and solicit it. So that when I hear what you just said, I thought of this guy. In his session, because he would have been on the side. Again, he didn't call himself a Wiccan. He was wider than that. Okay, but that's the same kind of, again, magical thinking. That we're talking about.
Certainly.
Yes. Do you think Wicca has any other kind of attachment to, anything that you would just pop into your head about some of the things we've talked about before, as far as
you mean
the worldview?
A kind of overlap with elements of like the primal witch. There's certainly going to be some things. Many of the neo-pagan practitioners, to use a more general term even than Wicca, they often practice herbalism, or they learn herbal medicine. So there's certainly elements of that. That you can find, again, as part of the makeup of this primal witch.
Right, and typically they're in it because they think it has some sort of, again, I'm going to use the M word, magical power, and that could be an attachment to what we would call the spiritual
Right,
world.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
that's what distinguishes them from, like, I'm a homeopath here, and I just think
Right.
this works better than what the drug companies
Right,
put out.
exactly.
Yeah. So there has to be that sort of spiritual element to it.
Yes.
Well, this is interesting. I think, our audience is going to, benefit from it, having a good, at least, overview, things to look for.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I think, we'll list some of the things you referred to, on our companion website. And I think this will be a good way to get, our audience, interested in, into some of these topics a little bit down the road.
Certainly.
Yeah, thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
Yep. Thank you for watching another episode of Fringe Pop 321. Please go to our website, fringepop321.com, again, for some of these sources, some other information about the topics we've been talking about with Dr. Burton. And if you want to support what we're doing, go to fp321.com/S as in Sam. To support what we're doing, we would appreciate it. Please consider doing that, and come back and watch more episodes, because what you know may not be so.